Well, welcome everybody to our first panel dealing with the very, very, very delicate and sensitive issues of freedom of speech and what should we do as a society and our governments to deal with free speech issues at a time of all the kind of fake news that we were just hearing about. What can governments do? What policies can do, especially as we begin thinking of, my gosh, what have we learned from the pandemic and going forward? What kind of policies can we prevent the kind of misinformation that we've had, but still protect free speech, which is fundamental to our democracies, at least this democracy and others that we share so much with. So we have an extraordinary panel to talk about these things this morning, and what they're going to do is just make a few brief remarks, and then we're going to open it up to real questions and the discussion amongst them and amongst you in the audience. So I really want to have this to be an interactive discussion as much as possible, because we think it'll be richer and more interesting for everybody to participate in. So we're going to start with Joan Donovan. Joan is at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, where I had the great fortune once upon a time, Shorenstein Fellow. She's research director. She is really a guru within anybody who knows anything about these issues, because she's just a leading thinker and a leading researcher. And so I'm going to start with Joan. I'll introduce each of our panelists as we go along. So Joan, you want to kick off, please?
Definitely. Sorry about that. I was looking for the mute button. Thank you for that introduction. And I just want to say that it was a pleasure to go to dinner with so many of the conference organizers last night, and that wonderful keynote. And what I study is effectively the internet, by and large. I began as a scholar of social movements because I'm very concerned with what happens between the wires and the weeds. And for as long as the social web has been direct into people's homes and telephones, it's been governed by a law of decontrol. So if you think about Section 230 not as enabling certain kinds of innovation, but one as disabling a kind of market, a tech market that would have developed where there were many different kinds of services throughout the tech stack that made the net happen and that made social media as profitable as it is, we might have a very different technology now. So the Section 230, as it's been debated, most people say, it enables platforms to be able to do content moderation. It came about at a time in 1996 when the worst thing you had to worry about with the internet was essentially email spam. You couldn't really send an MP3, so the concerns over copyright were not as pronounced. If you did want to download an MP3 in 1997, you'd have to set up your computer to work pretty much all night, and that's if you had Ethernet. I know this because I went to Northeastern where Napster was invented and people had access to it. But it wasn't fast and on demand. It didn't make the technology at the time didn't make every single individual a broadcaster. And that's what we're up against right now, is how do you regulate something where the incentives and the design are so centralized and so concentrated in a few companies that, we're all familiar with the motto of move fast and break things, but there was also another motto animating tech in the early aughts, which was get big fast. And the idea was to produce so much scale that you could utilize. Well, monetizing the data came a little bit later, but you could utilize people's networks in different ways to deliver messages, and in some instances advertising. But again, that only came around 2012, the advertising, the vein of advertising that we're familiar with through social media. But by and large, I want you to think about, okay, if we have this one way of decontrol, of creating an incentive structure where companies try to get big fast and they don't really think about any of the harms that their product might be causing to other sectors or to society at large, which is why we talk about true costs. So there's economic costs to running a huge platform. If we think about the decimation of journalism, especially local news, platform companies have played a very large role in pushing content that is cheap or free. It's been difficult for news organizations that use a subscription model to get the same kind of distribution as news organizations that relatively give their content away for free or monetize through advertising on their websites. But by and large, 230 created the political context in which we arrive in this moment where these companies have massive scale. And as a result, our own technological imagination about what the future of the internet can be is completely stifled. We are not able to imagine a future without Facebook, a future with technologies of appropriate scale, so that, and as Jessica, I'm sure, is going to tell you, so that they can do the proper work they need to do to ensure that they're protecting the civil and human rights of users, and they're protecting the interests of customers, which essentially are advertisers at this point. But I'll close on this last point, which is to say that there's a panoply of different ways that government is trying to legislate in this moment, and not all of them are good. Some of them are more interesting than others in terms of what the enforcement would look like, but we're starting to see different technologies, different rulemaking and policy around transparency of algorithms, transparency of how the technology works, transparency of how you are targeted online for certain kinds of messages. And there's two effects of policy like that. I can't imagine policy like that actually passing, because these companies will say these are trade secrets, and it would decimate the business if you unveiled how they essentially make their money through targeted messaging. But the second effect is to create a broad public discourse that may inspire other inventors to create technology that has more of these public interest options available to them, or public interest features. And so we have to think about, as scholars and researchers, which way we want the future of the internet to go. Because I do think there's a big role for civil society to play, not just in the shaping of these bills, but in the shaping of public conversation about how to think about the internet and how to think about innovation. Because right now it's nearly monopolistic how these companies work globally, especially in different spaces and places. It's very hard to get access to the internet. In the US, we are very fortunate, but our problems are different than what we see in other countries, who are, countries where the phone you buy comes with free basics and your only access to the internet is through a Facebook app, for instance, and how does that shape the world that you see? And so we're somewhere between the utopian vision of the early internet policymakers, where they thought, okay, let's make sure that internet technologies are not constrained by the people who use them, and that you're not liable for something that someone posts online. But at the same time, it's in that utopia that we've really landed us in this really dark dystopic moment where it's very difficult to communicate science. It's very difficult to communicate civic values. And of course, what we saw in 2020 and through January 6th of 2021 was probably the worst use case scenario for how distributed disinformation would harm a nation. And so I'll leave it at that. I'm sure Alex is going to try to fight me on some of this. And Jessica, I hope we're aligned a little bit. But looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, Alex, looks like you're gonna, you've been set up already. So Alex Abdo is the inaugural litigation director at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia. That institute is really, I've been delighted to see it the way it's grown and the many things it's done, but it's unusual that as a university institute actually gets involved in litigation itself. And Alex is the guy who's doing that. So we're very fortunate to have him here. Alex, your chance to run with the ball and disagree with Joan if you'd like.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here. Joan, I don't know why you think I disagree with any of that. I agree with everything that you just said. Well,
then I didn't do a good job.
I'm sure we'll find some areas to disagree, but let me start, with a background setting that has been helpful in my own thinking about this. So, in the pre-digital world or the physical world, the rules that governed what people would see and come across were more or less knowable and more or less understood. The people who are choosing to attend this conference, for example, they know that when they click on the Zoom link, this is the conversation that they're going to be presented with. They associate themselves with particular people or particular conversations in a fairly open and obvious process governed basically by the laws of physics, right? You hear what you're next to, or you hear what you choose to expose yourself to. But on the social media platforms, those rules are fundamentally different. What you're exposed to is not determined by the ordinary rules of physics or by your own, independent choices. They're determined by algorithms that prioritize conversations and your feeds in ways that we don't understand, that you can't understand, because they're based on machine learning algorithms whose training data is not disclosed to the public and so can't be studied in an easy way. And this, to my mind, is a kind of new physics of public discourse, and we just don't understand it. We don't know the rules that are structuring our public discourse, and we don't know what effects those new rules are having on public discourse, on our society, on elections, on our media ecosystem. And we desperately need to better understand, understand those new physics of public discourse, so that we can come up with solutions or imagine alternatives, or, as Joan proposed, reject the frame entirely and, imagine something entirely different than the world that we have now. And it's worth being clear that Facebook is not inevitable. That the current structure of social media is not inevitable. They haven't been around that long, and it'd be a mistake to think that they'll necessarily be around in 10 years, or at least around in the form in which they currently are around. But let me explain why it's so hard to study the social media platforms and what I think of as some of the lowest hanging fruit in the conversation about how to improve public understanding, and as a result, create consensus around, possible reforms. So the first problem is that the platforms themselves, as a general matter, release very little information that would enable people like Joan to do her work. They just don't release all that much data that researchers or journalists would find useful. There are some examples of platforms doing this, and strangely enough, Facebook is near the lead of the pack when it comes to actually disclosing data. But the measures that Facebook and other companies have taken so far are far from adequate to enable the kind of research that we need. And just to give you one example, one of Facebook's signature efforts right now is what it's calling its 2020 election study, in which it has released some data relevant to the 2020 election in the US. But the data set that is disclosed to researchers, or that is working on disclosing to researchers, is extremely narrowly targeted at that very short period of time, doesn't include data going up through the January 6th riot, for example, which you might actually want if you want to study the aftermath of misinformation in the lead up to the election. And it doesn't include data relating to more recent elections, even ones where they're heavily contested and where misinformation is thought to play a significant role. We're getting this sliver of a snapshot into what is by now historical by internet standards, rather than an ongoing commitment by the company to understanding what's going on the platform. The second problem is that, and this to my mind is the more troubling one, is that independent researchers and journalists who study the platforms face legal liability for doing so. And that's because most of the platforms prohibit the use of the kinds of digital tools that researchers and journalists would need to use to independently study the platforms. And I'll give you an example from my own practice. We represent right now 2 researchers at New York University, at NYU, who study the flow of disinformation on Facebook through advertisements. And the way they do it is by recruiting consenting Facebook users to install a browser plugin that donates the ads shown to these users, along with the ad targeting information. This information is stripped of anything personally identifying, it's de-anonymized, there's nothing that is connected back to any individual user or any individual user ID. But the data turns out to be extremely important in studying the spread of disinformation on Facebook's platform, and has resulted in all sorts of interesting and important discoveries by these researchers, including, for example, that Facebook, it turns out, is very bad at designating advertisements that are political or not political on its platform. But Facebook's reaction to this research was not to welcome it, but to send a cease and desist letter to the researchers, claiming that the browser plugin violated its terms of service, and specifically its term prohibiting automated collection of information without our prior permission. And that's a real problem, because that kind of independent research is essential. Even if the platforms got their voluntary disclosures right, even if they did right by people like Joan and the other researchers studying the platforms, we would still need to vet that data independently to make sure that we weren't running into the Volkswagen problem. And this is the problem where Volkswagen had programmed its cars to send different emissions data when it was connected to emissions testing equipment. You need to be able to, to prevent that problem, to verify that the data you're getting is accurate. So what's the solution, to this transparency problem? Well, I think there are a couple of different things that we need. And again, I think of this as a low-hanging fruit, and I take Joan to be focused more on the larger, structural problems, which are, I think, ultimately probably more important, but to my mind, transparency is a stepping stone to them. First, I think we need a safe harbor to protect independent research and journalism focused on the platforms. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. We proposed our own version of this that would be a legislative safe harbor in the US that would essentially immunize researchers and journalists for violating certain terms of service in their research, so long as they scrupulously protected the privacy of platform users, and so long as they weren't, breaking the platforms. That draft safe harbor has actually made its way almost verbatim into the bill proposed by Senators Coons, Klobuchar, and Portman, the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, the PATA bill. Whether that goes anywhere, we'll see. I wouldn't hold your breath. The other model is, what is enshrined now in the GDPR. I think it's Article 89 of the GDPR contains an exception for public interest research and journalism that is being fleshed out now in the Digital Services Act. How that ends up, I think, will be extremely important to the future of research on the platforms. And then a final model you might consider is something that is a requirement that the platforms disclose certain especially important information in privacy protective ways, either publicly or to vetted researchers, depending on the sensitivity of the data. And there are models, for this that are out there. Professor Nate Pursley at Stanford has, drafted a version of this kind of bill that also appeared in the PATA bill. And that's a significantly more complicated effort, I think, but it's one that's worth studying very, very closely. So I think that's the kind of low-hanging fruit. Let me just say one word about the First Amendment, which I know we're going to talk about more at length, but let me just say one word about it now, because it's really important to the conversation. I think generally speaking, there are two kinds of regulations for First Amendment purposes. It's a lot more complicated than that, but at a rough shot, there are two kinds of regulations for First Amendment purposes when it comes to the platforms. The first is the category of regulations that go after content moderation decisions directly. So regulations that say, for example, platforms must take this kind of speech off their platforms, or they must moderate public discourse in particular kinds of ways. And then there are essentially every other kind of regulations, generally speaking, that are directed at the structure of our media environment or at the businesses themselves. The First Amendment, as a general matter, is going to leave a lot less room for the first of those kinds of regulations, because those go to the heart of what the companies claim are their free speech rights, and what you might think of as the free speech rights of their users to engage in misinformation, for example. I think reasonable people can disagree about whether the First Amendment should protect the platforms in that way. And the Supreme Court has not resolved the question about how exactly the First Amendment applies to the platforms as against these kinds of regulations. But as a general matter in the US, there's going to be less room for that kind of regulation. And that's important, I think, in thinking through what kinds of solutions are worth the effort to develop and put forward, at least in US Congress, in the US legislature. But that raises one important caveat, which is don't forget about international regulation. In large part because of the First Amendment, but also just because of the dysfunction of Congress right now, we're much more likely to see movement on platform regulation abroad than we are domestically. And so even if the First Amendment does limit our choices domestically, we shouldn't let that limit our imagination, because good ideas could be picked up in other jurisdictions, even if they wouldn't pass constitutional muster here in the US. The one thing I haven't discussed is 230, but I think we can get to that in a minute in the conversation. And maybe Joan, you and I can find ways to disagree there. But I'll leave it at that for now. I'm really interested to hear what Jessica says.
Well, that's a great lead into our last speaker, to Jessica Dheere. And Jessica does something that I value very much as director of the Ranking Digital Rights. And that is precisely looking at what other countries are doing and being able to be comparative about that. And she's doing something I've wanted to do myself, and I'm so glad she's doing it and doing it so well. And not only is she looking at among all democracies, but she's also very involved in the Middle East and all the sorts of governments that we have there, as a founder and an former executive director of SMEX. And so, Jessica has walked the walk as well as talked the talk. So Jessica, for me, it's a delight and honor to meet you here this way for the first time, and I turn it over to you.
Why, thank you so much. I'm really honored by that introduction, and hope I'll do it justice. And thanks, Joan and Alex, for your provocations as well. So yeah, I have been in the digital rights field, as we call it, as sort of activists, practitioners, organizers, since the mid 2000s, and sort of watched this grow. And I started in this field in the Middle East, founding and leading an organization, SMEX or SMEX, for more than a decade, and sort of being on the receiving end of a lot of the practices of the companies that I now sort of lead Ranking Digital Rights to evaluate year after year. And for the past 2.5 years, I've been with RDR, which was founded by Rebecca McKinnon, hopefully a name that many of you know, who was a co-founder of Global Voices as well. And it was founded in 2013 after the publication of her book, Consent of the Networked, which was sort of one of the first sort of comprehensive accounts of corporate power in the digital sphere and what we should be worried about. And in which she foresaw the dangers of a world in which, quote, the corporations and governments that build, operate, and govern cyberspace are not being held sufficiently accountable for their exercise of power over the lives and identities of people who use digital networks. This was a decade ago. And so we've been following along over the last decade and sort of watching this debate evolve and sort of the problems emerge from this power that continues to sort of escalate and consolidate among the companies. And what Ranking Digital Rights does to try to address that, fundamentally, we're focused on transparency as well, as Alex was noting, and the accountability that can come from transparency. So, you have to have the baseline first. You have to have some information out there to be able to evaluate accountability. So we focus on transparency and corporate accountability in the tech and telecom sector, specifically using a human rights-based framework, not a First Amendment framework, just for the purposes of this conversation. And the UN guiding principles on business and human rights in particular. And what we do is evaluate the policies of 26 companies around the world, both tech and telecom companies, and evaluate their policies against a set of 58 human rights-based indicators in 3 categories: governance, freedom of expression, and privacy. And we use those evaluations, which create a vast amount of data, to create sort of company report cards and rankings of companies, so that we are both sort of contributing information that is really painstaking to sort of assemble and create, as well as then using that information to rank companies, hoping that we can create a kind of race to the top amongst those companies, that when they see themselves ranked against their peers, that will engender a kind of competition among them to do better. So we publish more or less annually, and on April 27th of this year, we will be releasing our next ranking. One slight alteration is that we will only be releasing on digital platforms this spring, and in the fall, we will release on the telecom companies, whereas in the past, we've done both at the same time to allow us to go a little bit more deeply into the distinctions between these companies. So where we're sort of at in this conversation that's been going on now for at least a decade and more is, and with the topic at hand today of sort of redefining free speech in the digital era, we're really focused on a part of the conversation that historically has not gotten as much attention as it should have, which is the ads and speech, and how does paid speech, or how dealing with the targeted advertising and surveillance-based advertising models that we're seeing, how if we could do more to regulate those, that we might actually have a better outcome. In 2020, we published a report called It's the Business Model, where we really focused on trying to outline how algorithms work. Alex, you did a great job of sort of setting that out, and what the sort of challenges and impacts, negative sort of externalities, as they often are called, of algorithms and the targeted advertising business models of the companies. And since that, over the last couple of years, one of the recommendations from that report was about ad transparency, because a lot of the examples that we looked at was from the 2020 sort of election cycle, and a lot of the political advertising and just advertising sort of in general on the platforms. And so a couple of things have emerged for us over the past couple of years. And one is that from the perspective, or if we look at sort of the conversation around content moderation of user-generated content, which is a very important one, we have disproportionately focused on that at the expense of really looking at the ad ecosystem. And since we're at a conference that's named for Edward R. Murrow, I think, and just sort of about journalism in particular, I think what we've started to say to ourselves is we need to follow the money if we're actually going to make any inroads into these companies. We need to scare them where it hurts the most. And that is in trying to get them to open up about their ad targeting systems and how they work, and what kinds of categorization that they're doing based on our data and the inference, the collection and inference of our data, and then how they're using that and algorithms to create those categories and then push them out in towards push them out into that ad ecosystem. And so part of our reframing exercise has been not to think of these companies as social media platforms or, you know, as the digital public sphere, but to think of them as ad tech companies and to name them as such, because that's what they are. And so, you know, if I had one goal for this intervention of mine, it is that everybody in the room and everybody listening starts calling Facebook and Google in particular, but any company that uses surveillance-based advertising as an ad tech company. It's just much more direct. As Joan said, their customers are not their users, they're their advertisers. And so I want to go just being as aware of time as I can be possibly. The reason why we want to focus on the ad ecosystem is because we have a sort of idea. First of all, it's a very complex ecosystem, but it could be easier to govern ads than to govern user-generated content. There's less volume of them, as this is from an article that my colleague Natalie Marichal wrote recently in Tech Policy Press about Facebook being an ad tech company. There's less volume of ads. There's no expectation of immediate publication as you might have for a news feed. That paid speech has less protection under freedom of expression standards and is already regulated, especially in terms of elections and also regulated even more closely internationally. And companies can set their own rules and ensure that they're enforceable. We've done, so one of the things that we did sort of to anticipate focusing more on the algorithms and targeted advertising ecosystem is develop new indicators last year for our report that look specifically at what companies are telling us about these systems, because as we have been saying, transparency is really important. And we ask a few questions. How do companies build and train their algorithms? How do they notify users about sort of what their targeted advertising policies are, what the changes are, and specifically, how do they enforce them? And we get very little data on the enforcement side. So they can have these policies that sort of say, this is the kind of content that we will allow in an ad, but they will not necessarily tell you how they enforce them. They release very little data in their transparency reports, for example, on how they enforce their ads. And we see this as sort of a very big loophole in the sort of overarching conversation. I'm real conscious of time, so I just want to go straight into the targeted advertising part of things. Only one company in our last ranking offered anything about impact assessment of targeted advertising, which has been shown to be a driver of discrimination and hate speech and extremist speech, conspiracy theories, etc. While most platforms provide some information on their ad targeting practices or policies, they don't give adequate information about changes to those policies. They don't say very much about whether any of the categories that people are put into through inferred data are reviewed by humans. So we have machines that are basically deciding a lot of this for us, as has already been said. And there's very little disclosure about what users can do to collect and infer and retain that information. Of their information, their data. There's also very little in the way of human rights impact assessments by any surveillance, ad targeting, ad tech companies. And sometimes, as in the case of Facebook, it's only after there's been a civil rights audit, and so they're responding after they've already done significant harm. Just to sum up a little bit, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. I think where RDR is that we're not going to solve our speech problem. We're never going to have a perfect speech environment where there's no misinformation or disinformation or hate speech or extremism. And while we need to continue working on the strategies for moderating that kind of speech, that we're going to keep ourselves sort of stuck in the whack-a-mole and the compromising of free speech principles if we don't think about sort of the where the revenue is generated from the companies. We're not going to solve our speech problem without sort of looking more closely at the ad problem, which requires a lot more transparency from companies about how their business models work, and what the effects are. And we need to know a lot more to be able to regulate it effectively. And just sort of on a broader note, I see this as one part of sort of how we are sort of trying to work together to close the space in which companies have sort of operate. They've had very free reign for a very long time in terms of what they can and cannot do, very little regulation. And it's going to take sort of looking at paid speech. It's going to take looking sort of with policymakers and investors, civil society, a whole range of people working together, sort of a global movement on the scale of the global power that these companies have amassed in order to sort of imagine the kind of future and the kind of internet that we would like to have going forward. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much. So I think everybody should just jump in. Joan, you've different softballs have been lobbed at you. You want to respond to anything? And why don't we get some discussion back and forth? And I'm happy to intervene with questions along the way.
No, I think everything here, it reflects the good work that's being done by the Knight First Amendment Institute and Ranking Digital Rights. I think the thing that we're most aligned on as a community of researchers and practitioners is this idea that technology should be put into the service of people, but that we can't just trust that companies are going to do best by society, right? We have to, especially in the case of the researchers at NYU that built a tool that allows them to look at advertising on Facebook. They did so in such a way that was, people who were installing the tool knew that they were installing the tool. It was their Facebook accounts that they were reporting data on. But Facebook was saying, you can't research this way, you can't audit this way. And I think the frontier of the next wave of conversations about digital human and civil rights is going to be about auditing. It's going to be about the kind of schematics that Ranking Digital Rights puts together as a way to know, well, are these companies really building with such intention that when something bad happens, we can in full faith say, that was truly an accident. It was an unforeseeable, unintended consequence. But in our field and in most fields that deal with infrastructure, there are things we would call normal accidents. You build an oil pipeline, you know it's going to leak, right? And so it's inevitability for some of these normal accidents. You don't just build a plane and say, well, there's no way it's going to crash, right? You put the black box recorder in it, you build in safety mechanisms into a car. You don't assume a car is never going to crash. You put seatbelts in. A seatbelt doesn't help the car drive better. They're annoying, right? Just a bicycle helmet is annoying, right? But we do that anyway because we want to ensure our own safety and the safety of others. And so we have to think about the intentionality of these products, and then external transparent auditing systems that ensure that when these normal accidents come up, that we have braced against them in some way. The hard part, I think, is really naming certain kinds of harms. Like, how do you measure and name a harm to democracy, right? Especially when, 2020 was such an odd year. Of course, the pandemic is raging. We're trying to figure out how to get people to the polls or to get them to vote. There's this broad push to get people to vote by mail. And then you have a person in power that is going to predictably reject the outcome if he doesn't win. Like, everybody knows that this is how it's going down, right? And I think as researchers, we felt a bit like Chicken Little, trying to tell these platform companies, hey, your tools are going to be used to mobilize many, many people by distributing these lies at massive scale and massive volume. And for the most part, they were just like, well, I mean, we can't control what people do on our platform. But this isn't the open web. It's not the same thing as trying to corral or deal with people putting up websites and having control over that. Platforms, content moderation only becomes possible because of platforms design, right? Content moderation is something that is a feature of centralized communication technologies. And so we only get the problem of moderation when we get the technology that could potentially add in such a feature. However, the scale problem persists because platform companies aren't able to moderate at scale. And so in some respects, we're asking them to do an impossible task. But on the other hand, you have people who are very popular, repeat offenders. They know what they're doing. They have a strategy, a communication strategy that utilizes these platforms. But by and large, it's really hard to say, oh, this is the kind of threat to democracy that is going to warrant some kind of regulation or some kind of institutional response. And we are oscillating between, do we hold the source accountable, right? Do you hold people who posted information that Dominion voting systems were flipping votes? Or do we hold the system that amplified that information responsible, right? And we keep hedging between those two. Section 230 would have you believe it's the source. But in our world of misinfo research, we know it's much more complicated. And so I think that's where the free speech question actually hinges too, which is you have a right to say whatever you want, you have a right to think your own thoughts, but under what conditions are platform companies exacerbating the harm you might cause? By distributing that lie to many millions of people. And so prior to that, and Edward, you probably know exactly when we had laws that said, hey, defamation is not gonna be something that cable news or AM radio is going to be able to withstand. But we don't have such laws on the internet, which creates this this vacuum of responsibility.
Can I jump in on the 230 question, and broader too? Because I think it's a really important point that Jonah is making. But here's kind of how I think about it. I think 230, the immunity that Section 230 provides, is responsible for, I think at the end of the day, a very small part of the misinformation problem. And the reason I say that is because most of the misinformation and disinformation that people are focused on is actually protected speech under the First Amendment. Now, actual defamation And defamation is a very narrow definition in the US, but actual defamation is not protected by the First Amendment. And so if you got rid of 230 immunity, the platforms, would potentially be responsible for not just the amplification, but the hosting, the hosting of defamatory statements. But most misinformation is not actually defamation within the meaning of US law, because defamation has to be about a particular person, and it has to be a provably false fact, provably false statement of fact. So statements about Dominion voting, for example, are likely, would qualify as defamation because they're about a specific company and they're making, people are making specific factually false claims about that company. But most disinformation that we worry about isn't, about it either isn't about a person, or it could plausibly be defended as, opinion, protected opinion. And so I don't know whether I'm skeptical that eliminating 230 protection would actually address most of the misinformation or disinformation that people are concerned about. And it's worth thinking through too, if we go down that path, what the side effects would be of eliminating 230 protection broadly, because you wouldn't be just getting rid of defamation online. You'd be causing the platforms to regulate content on their platforms defensively to minimize their own legal liability. And there are a lot of false positives and false negatives when the platforms moderate, as we know from their spotty efforts at content moderation generally. And traditional communities, I think, are going to bear the brunt of that cost. Traditional marginalized communities are going to bear the brunt of their failed efforts.
Are they though? Like, that's such, I mean, I don't know, Alex. Straw man.
Well, let me give you an example. So if you are, if where I used to work at the ACLU, we would make we would make public statements all the time about companies or public officials who are responsible for torture or who we consider to be war criminals based on conduct that they engaged in. Those are clear, those statements are clearly capable of being defamatory if they're in fact false. And a platform that leaves one of those statements up would bear the risk that Donald Rumsfeld would be able to sue the platform for hosting, claims that he was responsible for torture. And unless a platform is willing to defend the truth of that statement, they're going to have a pretty strong incentive to take it down. And now that's just Donald Rumsfeld. Imagine, international human rights perpetrators, human rights persecutors, or repressive regimes who have these statements made about them all the time, who then might be able to sue their way out. And defamation law ends up being, there are examples of defamation cases that cleanse public discourse, but there's so many examples of defamation litigation that are designed to distort public discourse, like Devin Nunes's countless frivolous lawsuits against an anonymous, against several anonymous Twitter accounts, right? Devin Nunes mom and Devin Nunes cow.
But aren't we talking about a problem that plagues the rich and powerful, right? One of the sticking points that I have about this whole discourse is that, we really ruined social media by letting politicians use it, right? Like, we only arrive at these problems when people with resources are using other institutions to shape and manipulate these platforms, right? And so isn't that actually a problem with the law and not necessarily a problem of technology? Because is it that the legal systems, we would never be able to handle all of these lawsuits? I mean, it just seems like we're not trying to make these companies responsible, but in a flip side of it, and this is something that Jessica knows really well, is they make so much money off.
No, I agree. I don't disagree with what you just said. I just think, two things I think. One is that the majority of things that we care about are not actually actionable under US law and are protected by the First Amendment. So if we got rid of 230 immunity, it wouldn't actually prevent the companies from hosting most of the misinformation and disinformation that we care about. Not all of it. Some of it, like Pizzagate, is a specific, a specific factual claim about a specific, company.
Mm-hmm.
And that would, clearly be defamatory and they could sue. but most of what we care about doesn't fall in that realm, I don't think. And the second is that, to the broader point, this is a problem with our system of justice in the US. Most people who sue for defamation are the rich and powerful because litigating is expensive, and defamation suits are a really imperfect tool for enforcing, for protecting dignitary rights. But I absolutely agree with you, though, that the structure here is the problem. And I'm just not convinced that 230 reform, or at least broadly eliminating 230, is going to get us where we want to go. But I guess, to my mind, that we have two big problems on social media. So one is we have enormous kind of homogeneity of rules. And I was a biology major, and one thing you learn in biology is that heterogeneous systems tend to be more resilient and more resistant to disease, right? If you have a population that is very genetically diverse, it tends to be more resistant to the viral spread of disease. The platforms are extraordinarily homogeneous in the set of rules that decide what spreads. And so it is entirely unsurprising that they are susceptible to the viral spread of misinformation and disinformation and other harmful speech, because they are these massive single points of failure, right? Facebook has its algorithms that decide what spreads, what's going to be amplified and what isn't, largely determined based on engagement, which is, as you said, Joan, does not internalize the public interest at all. It's about maximizing a private interest, maximizing their profit. But even setting that aside, it's going to be hijacked, because people are going to figure out how to hijack that system, because it's not resilient in the way that a more diverse set of platform, moderation tools might be. That, to my mind, points toward more structural interventions, like either making these companies smaller in some way, or addressing the competition problem so that there's more competition by, for example, privacy regulation, so that they can't get to the size that they have gotten to by exploiting private data, or maybe unbundling their services. So one interesting proposal would be to unbundle their networks from the services they provide on top of the network, so that the network effect doesn't prevent competitors from getting in. I don't think this would solve all the problems that you're worried about, Joan, but to my mind, it would, get at a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of what y'all are talking about is why we're focusing more on the ads, because it just feels like such a cyclical conversation, or just like a conversation, a loop that you can't get out of, sort of talking about whether Section 230 should or should not be there. I think the amplification is, the reach aspect is where the company, that is where the major problem happens. And the other part is sort of the revenue generation, and sorry, I had a thought and I've lost it now, but a lot of the reason why we're sort of like felt like we're in this hole of trying to figure out, what should be done with Section 230, if anything, and what will the effects be. And then thinking about the fact that, yes, it's the people in power who have the resources to run the ads, to basically distribute the content in different ways. And it doesn't only have to be, and like fixing that problem doesn't only fix parts of the misinformation, disinformation problem, or at least help to mitigate it. It also sort of fixes other pieces of the puzzle, which is in the sense of, having federal privacy legislation and sort of trying to not have all of our data out there everywhere being sold and brokered. And the other piece was, forgive me, I'm just scattered. I'll come back to it at some point, but I think a lot of why we are trying not to focus on the sort of the First Amendment and the free speech questions and rather sort of looking at the role of advertising, is because of how much revenue it generates, and that it seems like a more manageable in some ways thing. And it's also what the companies don't want to tell us about. And the other piece was that there was an article that Professor Jack Balkin wrote recently about this, where the conflict of interest of these platforms, Facebook and Google in particular, both, being ad brokers, providing the space, like the monopoly is in the ad market itself. And so it's not necessarily for me about breaking up WhatsApp from Instagram, from Facebook, in Meta. It's really about deconstructing the ad market as a way of that would put the fear of, I think, a lot of companies, the fear got into a lot of companies. If you talk about, if you could start a conversation and really work on breaking up the ad market itself. You go to Google now, you do a search, and the first, I don't know how many results are all advertising at this point. So it's almost to the point where it's not even useful anymore. And so that is why we're sort of taking this more narrow and sort of maybe niche approach of sort of looking at what paid speech and what managing paid speech better would do, or moderating paid speech better would do.
Yeah, and I think, there's Alex probably knows more about this than I do, but there's, the sort of Brandeis ruling that has made it so that we think about paid speech as also free speech, right? And people do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can print anything. There are some really interesting local laws around billboards, right? And so you can't put up a billboard that says vaccines cause autism in most places because it's a public health problem that you're causing. And so there are rules about paid speech in other sectors that could be applicable. And then there's a good question in the chat about like crowdsourcing, fact checking and what the role is there for adding more high quality information into the information ecosystem. And one of the ways that we saw this happen during the pandemic, early on, I wrote a piece for MIT Tech Review about, public health agencies and others employing digital advertising to reach local markets so that you could give updates on the current guidance about the pandemic and give people more understanding about how to get tested and these eventually online advertising on platforms became a kind of gift that platforms gave to public health agencies. They would give them free advertising so that they could reach local audiences. And so these technologies are not inherently terrible, right? Targeted messaging is really important for societies, especially in a public health crisis. But at the same time, you have to know what's riding on the rails of the tracks that you built, right? And they, have consistently, especially Facebook, made it so that they don't really know what's happening until users raise a flag, users report it. And so it's really important that we think about paid speech, compelled speech as it doesn't have to work this way. The classifieds in a newspaper, somebody reads those before they get put in the newspaper. But Facebook has consistently argued, well, we don't have to review advertising because that's not how our system works. And of course, it's true. They don't have to do anything. But I think I'll just close with this point that it's indicative of a broad shift of the public starting to realize that social media is becoming an institution, just like newspapers like the New York Times and WAPO have become institutions, just like universities have become institutions. And it breaks my heart to say that, but at the same time, people are requesting more and more high quality, truthful information from these platforms, from Google search, from Facebook search, from Twitter. And it's not a bad thing, though, that society itself is facing this inevitability. And what's interesting is we're seeing these institutions come into conflict with each other. We're seeing social media come into conflict with legacy journalism, for instance, and that will get worked out over time, but it might not be to our advantage. One of the things that we would want to do is create room for all of that. But instead, social media has such a great pipeline of revenue by taking all the advertising dollars that unfortunately we're going to see the decimation of important social institutions while we watch these companies hoard resources in such a way that doesn't serve the public interest, which is why we have government. Government's supposed to mitigate some of those problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, and this, to one of your points, kind of in the middle of what you were saying, Joan, but also to kind of to what you were saying earlier, Jessica, and this question that somebody asked about David Rand's research. I think fundamentally, one of the challenges we have navigating social media is that humans are not good at assessing trustworthiness at a distance. And that is kind of fundamentally the problem of communicating over these platforms. In real life, when you talk to somebody, you assess their trustworthiness based on probably countless behavioral factors and indications that your eyes pick up on and your ears pick up on that we don't even understand, as from a behavioral science perspective or a neurological perspective. We just don't understand that feedback that people are relying on which isn't to say that we're great at assessing trustworthiness in person, but we certainly are relying on a lot more indications of it than we have on social media, where you have the retweet count or the reshare count, the comment count, a few different colorful emojis. You have the fireball face, which may tell you something about how other people have viewed this content. But maybe another interesting set of interventions that the platforms could experiment with would be figuring out how to give people better tools for assessing truth. And I'm not at all naive enough to think that that's going to solve our problems. I think we need bigger structural changes to our kind of information ecosystem. But that to me, strikes me as one of the problems at the core of the global connectivity that the platforms have given us.
I wonder if I might pass on a question from the audience that touches on everything we're talking here, and that is, what are other countries doing that we can learn from, especially on this whole issue of content versus structural regulation? Other democracies and what they're doing. Can we learn from them, or do we see that the actual reverse of that with the renegotiation of NAFTA and so forth, that we're actually exporting Section 232 to our neighbors? Does anybody want to respond to that?
Honestly, oh, sorry. I don't know about. I'm not informed on the Section 230 part to Mexico, but in terms of other countries, I think there's sort of general consensus that the EU is sort of leading development of regulation at this point. Right. But I think all of these issues are very complicated, and I don't think you can point to any one country that seems to have solved, it has solved the problem. I don't know, maybe Alex and Joan have other thoughts on that. But I one thing that was interesting is, well, what's interesting to see is sort of the fragmentation of regulation in some ways, and how companies are dealing with it in different ways. So, we're very interested at this point. We're sort of trying to think about how do we look at the different policies that companies are putting in place to be compliant with EU regulation or even California regulation versus sort of, something broader. And what you're starting to get is sort of different policy environments for users in different places. at scale as well. And I think that's going to start to raise a lot of interesting sort of issues around, probably equity and why some users get certain policies and others get others. This is something that's been going on between sort of the global north and the so-called global south for a long time, where you have companies operating obviously from a US jurisdiction in terms of the big platforms, and then applying, I think, as Alex was referring to, homogeneous sort of policies worldwide, which raises all kinds of issues, as we've seen everywhere, and saw a lot in the Facebook papers last year, but notably in Myanmar, in the recent protest in Nigeria last year and SARS, where misinformation or where news can be called misinformation as well. And so just this homogeneity of policy hasn't served us well, and we're starting to see more. And I don't know that the fragmentation is going to do any better, but I don't think anybody's really getting it right, because this is such an intractable, in some ways, issue.
So when you talk about defamation, and especially Alex, I mean, when what about conspiracy theories and targeting Bill Gates or Fauci or Hillary Clinton, et cetera? Why aren't they considered within the ambit of defamation when what they say is so demonstrably false sometimes?
Well, it kind of depends on the statement. And, so the statement needs to be, again, about a specific person, and it needs to be a provably false assertion of fact. And one challenge that defamation plaintiffs have had litigating claims about speech made on social media and other kind of online forums is that courts tend to say, nobody takes these kinds of statements literally. And they use that logic to basically say, this is not an expression of fact, it's an expression of opinion. When somebody says, for example, Fauci is on the payroll of so-and-so. That on its face is a provably false assertion of fact. Whether Fauci is getting kickbacks from some company or what have you, it's an assertion of fact. But a court would probably say, this is a hyperbolic statement, not meant to be a literal statement that Fauci is getting kickbacks, but just generally questioning his credibility. And in that regard, it's an opinion. And so we're not going to allow that defamation suit to go forward, and we'll kick it out at the outset. That's how most of those kinds of hyperbolic statements would probably be assessed by courts. That has been a trend in the courts for some years now. But and then just to get to another kind of false fact we might care about, if somebody says vaccines cause autism online, for better or for worse, that is almost certainly protected by the First Amendment. Now, if they are a doctor dispensing medical advice, that's quite different, and that could be regulated. But if it's just a random person on the internet saying vaccines cause autism, courts would almost certainly say that's protected speech. And maybe you could come up with a logic for distinguishing an anonymous person saying that from a platform choosing to continue to hosting it. But I think it'd be an uphill battle in the courts to try to distinguish those two as a matter of First Amendment doctrine.
Interesting. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I mean, we could go on with these very fascinating discussion, and it's been so interesting with three such wonderful experts. You don't know how much we appreciate your joining in on today's conference to share all these thoughts. And I know I've learned some, and maybe I can even use some of it to because I go back into combat on these issues. But we really do appreciate everything, your participation here today. So thank you very much on behalf of the Fletcher School and the Murrow Center.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
So